17-year-old Imani Washington stepped off the school bus in full military camouflage. Her combat boots clanked against the concrete as whispers erupted around her like wildfire. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lincoln High's parking lot, but nothing could hide the stares that followed her every step. Is she seriously wearing that to homecoming week? Ashley Miller, the student body president, with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and designer everything, laughed loudly. Her voice carried that particular tone of disbelief, mixed with superiority that only came naturally to those who had never questioned their place in the social hierarchy. Within minutes, phones were out. Photos of Imani in her uniform were already circulating on social media. The captions came fast and merciless. "Wannabe soldier girl dress-up day isn't until Friday," and "Someone's having an identity crisis." Imani could practically feel the notifications pinging across the school's invisible network as her image spread from phone to phone, each share adding another layer to her humiliation. Her jaw tightened as she walked past a group of football players who had gathered near their lifted trucks, their Letterman jackets gleaming in the morning light. Kyle Thompson, the quarterback, whose ego was somehow larger than his already considerable frame, nudged his teammates and started marching in an exaggerated formation behind her. Left, right, left, right. He called out in a mocking drill sergeant voice, while his friends saluted with theatrical precision. 10 Hut, we've got ourselves a real soldier here, boys. The laughter that followed felt like needles against Imani's skin, but she kept walking, her spine straight and her eyes forward. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only made things worse. But this time, the taunts weren't just about the clothes. They carried a different, uglier undertone she had become all too familiar with since moving here. "Look at her," another player whispered, just loud enough for Imani to hear. "Probably thinks wearing that will get her some respect. But look at her, she's still just." He let the sentence hang, but the unspoken word lingered in the air, heavy and toxic. Black. The oversized camouflage jacket hung loose on her small frame. The sleeves were rolled up to reveal hands that trembled slightly, despite her outward composure. The fabric still carried the faintest scent of her father's cologne, a detail that both comforted and broke her heart every time she wore it. She had transferred to Lincoln High just 2 months ago when her mom got remarried to a kind but quiet man named Robert, who worked in insurance. The move had been necessary. Her mother couldn't bear staying in their old town, where every street corner held memories of Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington. But starting over at a new, predominantly white school in a wealthy suburb during her senior year was like trying to join a movie halfway through. Everyone already knew their roles, their groups, their place in the carefully constructed social ecosystem. As one of the few black students, her place seemed to have been decided for her on day one. She was a visible minority, and that made her a visible target. This was exactly the kind of attention Imani had hoped to avoid. She'd planned to fly under the radar, graduate quietly, and move on to college where she could start fresh once again. But today wasn't about fitting in or making friends or navigating the treacherous waters of high school politics. Today marked 3 years since the worst day of her life, and wearing her father's uniform was the only way she could feel close to him, the only ritual that made the crushing weight of his absence bearable. As she approached the main building, more students began to notice her unusual attire. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to track her movement. A group of theater kids near the drama department entrance started an impromptu performance, pretending to duck for cover and shouting, "Incoming!" with dramatic flair. Her locker was located in the most trafficked hallway of the school, a cruel twist of fate that meant her daily routine involved running a gauntlet of judgment. As she reached the familiar blue metal door, her heart sank. Someone had already been there. A handwritten note was taped to the locker. The words, "Guy Jane wants attention," were scrawled in thick black marker across notebook paper. Beneath the text, a crude caricature had been drawn of a figure with exaggeratedly large lips and kinky hair, wearing a military uniform. The racism was blatant. She ripped the note down with more force than necessary, crumpling it in her fist as students continued to stream past, many slowing their pace to get a better look at the girl in camouflage. Her combination lock felt slippery under her sweaty fingers as she tried to open it, the numbers blurring slightly as tears threatened to form in the corners of her eyes. "Nice costume," a voice said behind her. Imani turned to see Sarah Jenkins, a girl from her AP history class who always seemed relatively normal compared to the social media-obsessed crowd. But even Sarah's tone carried a note of bewildered amusement, as if Imani was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Is this for some kind of project or something? Imani finally got her locker open and began pulling out her books for first period, her movements mechanical and precise. Something like that, she replied quietly, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and too personal to share with someone who was essentially a stranger. As the first bell rang and students began their reluctant migration toward class, Imani caught her reflection in the small mirror she'd hung inside her locker door. Her father's dog tags hung around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of his old uniform shirt. In the reflection, she could almost see him standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice telling her to stand tall and be proud. But when she blinked, there was only the bustling hallway and the weight of 100 curious stares. By third period, the harassment had evolved from casual mockery into something more deliberate and cruel. Imani's chemistry class was typically her refuge, a place where equations and formulas provided clear, logical answers in a world that often made no sense. But today, even the sanctuary of science couldn't protect her from the growing storm of attention her uniform had attracted. She slid into her usual seat at the back of the room, hoping to blend into the background. But Tyler Brooks had other plans. Tyler was the kind of student who thrived on chaos, a class clown whose humor often crossed the line into cruelty. He'd been tracking Imani all morning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and chemistry class provided the ideal stage for his performance. As Mrs. Patterson began explaining molecular structures on the whiteboard, Tyler made his move. He abruptly stood up, claiming he needed to sharpen his pencil, but instead took a deliberately circuitous route that brought him directly past Imani's desk. With theatrical precision, he accidentally swept her textbook, notebook, and pencil case to the floor with a sweeping gesture of his hand. "Oops," he said loudly, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Sorry about that." Boom. He made exaggerated sound effects, kaboom, while gesturing wildly, mimicking the chaos of a battlefield. The timing was perfect. Mrs. Patterson had her back turned, writing a formula on the board, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding behind her. The entire class erupted in stifled laughter. Students covered their mouths with their hands, their shoulders shaking with suppressed giggles. Some didn't even try to hide their amusement, openly pointing and whispering to their neighbors. Imani's face burned with humiliation as she bent down to gather her scattered belongings. Her father's oversized sleeves made the simple task awkward and clumsy. "Careful there, soldier," Tyler whispered as he leaned down, pretending to help while actually kicking her pencil further under the desk. "Wouldn't want you to call in an airstrike on the chemistry lab." His voice was loud enough for the surrounding students to hear, and another wave of snickers rippled through the classroom. Imani's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white against the faded green fabric of her father's uniform. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to defend herself, to make Tyler pay for his cruelty. But she'd learned long ago that retaliation only made things worse, only provided her tormentors with more ammunition to use against her. So, she said nothing, simply returning to her seat and trying to focus on Mrs. Patterson's lecture on chemical bonds, though the words seemed to float meaninglessly in the air. The whispers continued throughout the period, a constant undercurrent of judgment and speculation. Why is she dressed like that? Is she trying to be different? Maybe she's having some kind of breakdown. Each comment felt like a small cut, and by the time the bell rang, Imani felt like she was bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Lunch period brought no relief. The cafeteria was a social minefield on the best of days, but today it felt like stepping into enemy territory. Imani grabbed a tray and moved through the food line, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed her every step. The cafeteria ladies looked at her with curious eyes but said nothing, though she caught one of them nudging another and gesturing in her direction. She found an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria, as far from the popular kids' territory as possible. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. It protected her from direct confrontation, but also made her an even clearer target, sitting alone in her uniform like a beacon of difference in a sea of conformity. For a precious few minutes, she thought she might make it through lunch unscathed. She picked at her sandwich, not really tasting anything, while trying to ignore the periodic bursts of laughter from nearby tables that she was sure were directed at her. But her peace was short-lived. Ashley Miller appeared at her table like a perfectly manicured storm cloud, flanked by her usual entourage, Brittany Walsh and Chloe Martinez. These were the girls who ruled Lincoln High's social hierarchy with iron fists and designer gloves, and they had clearly decided that Imani's uniform was a challenge to their authority. "Listen, military girl," Ashley began, her voice carrying that feigned tone of concern that popular girls had perfected over generations. She slid into the seat opposite Imani without invitation. Her perfect makeup and artfully messy hair were a stark contrast to Imani's bare face and simple ponytail. "We get that you're trying to be edgy or whatever, but this whole costume thing is getting really old." The cafeteria around them had begun to quiet. Conversations died down as students sensed a drama brewing. Phones appeared as if by magic, held discreetly, but ready to record whatever was about to unfold. This was better than reality television. This was real-time high school warfare, and everyone wanted a front-row seat. "Maybe you should try shopping at normal stores instead of Army surplus," Brittany added with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I mean, there are tons of cute boutiques in town. We could totally take you shopping sometime." The offer was delivered with such obvious insincerity that it felt more like an insult than an invitation. Chloe nodded enthusiastically, her voice taking on the condescending tone of someone explaining something to a small child. "Yeah, like we're not trying to be mean or anything, but you're kind of making everyone uncomfortable. It's like you're trying too hard to be different, you know?" Imani squeezed her plastic fork until her knuckles were white. The cafeteria was now almost completely silent. Hundreds of eyes were focused on their table like spectators at a gladiatorial match. She could feel the weight of their collective judgment, the hungry anticipation of students who smelled blood in the water. She slowly stood up, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but her eyes blazed with an intensity that made Ashley's confident smirk falter slightly. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Imani said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous, something that hinted at depths these girls couldn't begin to fathom. Ashley's smirk returned, emboldened by her audience and her own sense of social invincibility. She leaned back in her chair with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for her cruelty. "Oh, please," she said, her voice rising to ensure everyone in the cafeteria could hear. "What are you going to do? Call your daddy to come save you?" Those words hit Imani like a physical blow. They weren't just a generic taunt. They were a targeted strike, designed to exploit the stereotype of the absent black father. Ashley knew nothing about Imani's father, but in her narrow worldview, it was a high-percentage shot. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Just as Imani opened her mouth to respond, her lips parting to utter words that would either destroy her completely or finally reveal the truth she had carried like a stone in her chest, a sound, unlike anything Lincoln High had ever experienced, shattered the tense silence. It began as a distant rumble, barely perceptible beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights in the cafeteria, but within seconds it had grown into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The cafeteria windows rattled violently in their frames, causing some students to instinctively duck under their tables. Lunch trays clattered to the floor as the thunderous noise grew louder, more intense, until it felt as if the sound was emanating from inside everyone's chest. Ashley's confident smirk vanished as she looked around wildly, her perfectly styled hair whipping around her face as she tried to pinpoint the source of the overwhelming noise. "What the hell is that?" Tyler Brooks yelled over the din, but his voice was barely audible above the mechanical roar that now dominated every other sound. The overhead lights flickered ominously, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes crashed to the floor as the entire building seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity. Through the large windows along the cafeteria's eastern wall, a massive dark shadow swept overhead, momentarily eclipsing the afternoon sun and plunging the room into temporary darkness. A Black Hawk helicopter, its rotors churning the air into a visible maelstrom, appeared over the school like something from another world. The aircraft was enormous, its olive-green hull gleaming in the sun as it circled the building with military precision. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of its blades created a rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of everyone watching from below. "Oh my God," someone whispered, though the words were lost in the overwhelming noise. "Is that even real?" The helicopter completed a full circle around Lincoln High before banking sharply toward the football field. Students abandoned their lunches without a second thought, chairs scraping and toppling as hundreds of teenagers surged toward the windows and exits. Teachers tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order, but even they were craning their necks and pulling out their phones to record the unprecedented spectacle unfolding outside. "Everyone, calm down, Mrs." Patterson's voice was barely audible as she tried to herd her students, but her own eyes were wide with astonishment as she watched the military aircraft descend onto the 50-yard line. "Please remain in your seats." But her words fell on deaf ears. The cafeteria had erupted into controlled chaos as students jostled toward the exits, desperate to get outside and witness whatever was happening on the football field. Ashley and her crew were swept along with the crowd, their earlier confidence replaced by bewilderment and a growing sense that they had stumbled into something far larger than a simple lunchroom confrontation. Imani remained frozen at her table, watching the helicopter through the window as it settled onto the football field with practiced precision. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, and her hands trembled with recognition. She knew that aircraft, knew the unit markings painted on its side, knew exactly why it was here and what it meant. The helicopter's engines began to spool down, but its rotors continued to spin as figures in military dress uniforms emerged from the aircraft. Even from a distance, Imani could make out the crisp lines of their formal attire, the gleam of polished brass, and the ribbons that told stories of service and sacrifice. A breath caught in her throat as she recognized one of the figures stepping onto the field, tall, authoritative, with silver hair visible beneath her military cover. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, her father's former commanding officer, the woman who had delivered the news that changed Imani's life forever 3 years ago. Principal Williams's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the excited chatter and speculation that filled the hallways. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled awe as he made an announcement that would be remembered long after graduation day. "Attention students and faculty." His voice boomed through the building, competing with the still spinning helicopter blades outside. "We have an unusual situation developing on our campus. Imani Washington, please report to the main office immediately. I repeat, Imani Washington to the main office." The announcement hit the crowd like an electric shock. Hundreds of heads turned toward Imani, who was still standing frozen in the cafeteria, her father's oversized uniform suddenly feeling both too large and too small at the same time. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Imani Washington? Who's that? The girl in the army clothes. What did she do? Is she in trouble? Why is the army here for her?" Ashley's face had gone pale. Her earlier bravado evaporated as the implications of the situation began to sink in. The girl she had mocked, the target of her cruel jokes about calling your daddy to come save you, was somehow connected to the military helicopter that had just landed on their school's football field. Tyler Brooks looked like he was about to throw up. His face was a sickly green as he realized that his battlefield sound effects and explosion jokes might have been directed at someone with actual military connections. As Imani began walking toward the main office, the crowd parted before her like the Red Sea. Students who had been laughing at her just minutes before now watched in stunned silence, their phones recording her every step through the hallways. The combat boots that had seemed so out of place that morning now sounded different on the linoleum floor, no longer awkward or attention-seeking, but purposeful, meaningful. Teachers emerged from their classrooms, drawn by the commotion and the still-spinning helicopter blades outside. Even the most jaded faculty members, who had seen everything in their decades of education, stood in their doorways with expressions of astonishment and curiosity. This was unprecedented, extraordinary, the kind of event that would be talked about for years to come. Through the windows along the main hallway, Imani could see more military personnel emerging from the helicopter. They moved with the precise, coordinated efficiency of people accustomed to ceremony and protocol. A small crowd of soldiers formed on the football field, their dress uniforms immaculate despite the wind from the still-spinning rotors. Ashley and her friends followed at a distance, no longer the confident queens of the school, but uncertain observers of something they didn't understand. Their earlier mockery had been replaced by a growing sense of dread, a realization that they might have made a terrible mistake. The girl they had dismissed as an attention seeker was walking toward a meeting with military officials who had arrived by helicopter, and the implications of that truth were beginning to dawn on them. "What do you think is happening?" Brittany whispered to Ashley, her voice small and uncertain. Ashley didn't answer. She couldn't. For the first time in her high school career, she was completely out of her depth, watching events unfold beyond her comprehension or control. The social hierarchy that had seemed so important just minutes before suddenly felt trivial and meaningless in the face of whatever was happening on the football field. As Imani approached the main office, she could see Colonel Mitchell through the window, standing tall and dignified in her dress uniform. The woman who had been present for the worst moment of Imani's life was here, at her high school, bringing with her something that would change everything once again. The entire school had gathered on the football field in a spectacle that defied every rule and procedure Lincoln High had ever established. What had started as curious students sneaking out of class had become a mass exodus as teachers, administrators, and even cafeteria staff joined the unprecedented gathering. The Black Hawk helicopter sat like a sleeping giant on the 50-yard line, its rotors finally stilled, but its presence still commanded the absolute attention of the nearly 2,000 people now forming a massive semicircle around the aircraft. Principal Williams stood nervously beside Colonel Sarah Mitchell, his usual authority diminished in the presence of the highly decorated military officer, whose chest displayed ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of service and sacrifice. The colonel's silver hair was pulled back neatly in regulation under her military cover, and her demeanor exuded the quiet confidence that came from leading soldiers through impossible situations. Imani emerged from the school building, flanked by two junior officers, their polished boots clicking in perfect synchronized rhythm on the concrete walkway leading out to the field. The crowd parted before them like a living curtain. Hundreds of faces turned to track her movement, with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe to dawning comprehension. The girl who had been mocked and ridiculed just hours before now walked with the dignity of someone being escorted to receive the highest honors. Ashley Miller stood frozen near the bleachers, her face ashen as she watched the procession. The cruel words she had spoken in the cafeteria, "Call your daddy to come save you," echoed in her mind like a curse. Beside her, Tyler Brooks looked like he was about to collapse. His earlier jokes about explosions and airstrikes now seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially devastating in their callousness. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward as Imani approached, her voice carrying clearly across the silent stadium through a portable microphone that one of her aides had quickly set up. The sound system crackled, then settled, and as she spoke, her words reached every corner of the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty of Lincoln High School," she began, her voice steady and commanding. 3 years ago today, on the 15th of October, Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington made the ultimate sacrifice while serving his country in Afghanistan. He died saving 12 members of his unit when their convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the gravity of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't a drill or a demonstration or some educational program. This was real, personal, and heartbreaking, in ways most of these teenagers had never experienced. Colonel Mitchell continued, her voice growing stronger, as she spoke of a man she clearly respected and admired. Staff Sergeant Washington was a communications specialist, a father, and a hero who put the lives of his fellow soldiers above his own safety. When the convoy came under heavy attack, he left the relative safety of his armored vehicle to establish a communications link that would bring rescue to his trapped comrades. He was killed by sniper fire while completing that mission, but his actions saved 12 lives. Imani stood at solemn attention beside the colonel, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the story she knew by heart, but had never heard told before such an audience. Her father's dog tags felt heavy against her chest, and the oversized uniform that had seemed so awkward that morning now felt like a suit of armor, protecting her from the weight of everyone's gaze. His daughter, Imani, the colonel gestured toward her, has honored his memory every year on this date by wearing his uniform. She has carried his legacy with quiet dignity, never seeking attention or recognition, simply remembering a father who died serving something greater than himself. The silence on the field was now absolute, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional sniffle from someone in the crowd. Even the most cynical seniors, who prided themselves on being too cool to care about anything, stood transfixed by the unfolding ceremony. Colonel Mitchell reached into a wooden presentation case that one of her aides was opening. From it, she withdrew a folded American flag, its red, white, and blue fabric crisp and perfect, and a smaller wooden box that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Today, we are here to present Imani with two items that have been a long time coming, the colonel announced. First, this flag, which flew over the forward operating base where her father served and died. It was lowered to half-staff in his honor and has awaited the proper time to be presented to his family. She placed the flag in Imani's trembling hands, its weight somehow both lighter and heavier than she had expected. The fabric was soft, yet firm, and she could almost feel the history it carried, the lives it represented, the sacrifices it symbolized. And second, Colonel Mitchell opened the wooden box to reveal a medal that caught the sunlight and seemed to radiate its own internal light. The Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, which was posthumously awarded to Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington for his extraordinary heroism and selfless sacrifice. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the usual applause of a school assembly. This was something deeper, more reverent, the kind of applause reserved for moments that transcend ordinary experience. Students who had never considered military service found themselves wiping away tears, while teachers who had witnessed decades of graduations and ceremonies stood in stunned awe. As Colonel Mitchell pinned the medal to Imani's uniform, her father's uniform, she leaned close and whispered, "He would be so proud of the woman you've become. His courage lives on in you." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence. When it ended, the spell was broken, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of Lincoln High. Tyler Brooks was the first to approach Imani as the crowd began to disperse, his face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Your dad, he was a real hero. I didn't know. I'm so sorry for what I said." Imani looked at him, seeing not a bully, but a boy who had just learned a profound lesson. "He was," she said simply, "and now you know." Ashley approached next, her usual confidence shattered. "Imani, she started, then stopped. "I said terrible things about your father. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Imani replied, her voice holding no anger, only a quiet sadness. "You saw someone different and decided that made them a target. Maybe next time you'll think about what you don't know before you decide to hurt someone." As the helicopter prepared for departure, the students understood they had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The girl in camouflage was no longer a target for mockery, but a reminder that everyone carries stories, that heroism is real, and that sometimes the people we dismiss are connected to something far greater than high school social hierarchies. Imani stood on the field long after the Black Hawk had disappeared, clutching her father's Medal of Honor and feeling his presence more strongly than she had since the day he died. Around her, Lincoln High School was forever changed, and she knew that when she wore his uniform again, it would be with the understanding and respect it had always deserved.